Why is it that someone would even care to understand their genes and all the stuff that you do your testing for?
Your genes hold so much information, and they essentially instruct your body to do pretty much everything it's doing. Um, we're really starting to identify, at least we're scratching the surface on understanding exactly what our genes are telling our body to do. And right now, what we have uncovered, even though it's still very early stages of understanding genetics, what we are starting to learn is how genes are behaving in our susceptibility for diseases, right? Specifically areas like cancer, cardiovascular risk, even neurological disorders like Alzheimer's and early onset dementia, et cetera. And the incredible thing is that when you sort of understand and you can identify what your genes are telling your body to do, in a sense, you can outsmart them. Now, in the future, that might look like gene editing, right? Like literally changing what your genes are telling your body to do, physically editing them. Right now, what that looks like is understanding where your risks are and then taking actions to reduce those risks. So for example, if you know you have an increased risk for colon cancer, the best thing to do, knowing that, is starting screenings for colon cancer early, maybe even a decade or a decade and a half earlier. And the goal is to identify a problem in very early stages, or essentially before it becomes a full-blown problem. And that way you can totally eliminate your risk for developing that problem. So it's knowing what kind of secrets your genes are holding and then outsmarting them, changing your behaviors, doing more screenings, getting involved in your healthcare, and preventing, that risk from really even potentially happening for yourself. So it's really outsmarting your genes is what you can do with this information.
I'm glad you spelled it out that way, because before we hit record, I was talking about how my wife is just super excited that I'm talking to you, and she's fascinated with the service you're providing, which we'll get into the details here shortly. But it was probably 2 years of talking about, ever since like 23andMe and those other things where you swab your mouth and send it in whatever, and they find your genealogy. My wife was adamantly against them, and I was kind of confused for a while. I was like, this sounds really cool. I don't understand what the issue is. And then I think she told me that, like, if she was going to get cancer someday, she didn't want to know. And
Right.
so and it kind of dawned on me, like, oh, that's maybe not the correct, but a rational response to genetic testing. If you find
Totally.
out that you're predisposed to breast cancer, for example, that's terrifying, isn't it? But you're saying it's not a life sentence. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. And just to be clear, your wife is in the vast majority of people
Okay.
who are kind of like opposed or scared to get genetic testing. And the number one reason why people are opposed to doing it is because I don't know if they realize that they are actually more in control than they think they are. You think it's in my genes. It's written in stone. What am I going to do? I can't change my genes, right? It is what it is. The reality is twofold. Number one, these genes are, especially for cancer and cardiovascular disease and neurological disorders, they are not actually set in stone in a sense where if you have a mutation that could increase your risk for cancer or cardiovascular disease or whatever, it is a risk assessment. It is an understanding of what the likelihood of you developing this problem is. It does not guarantee that you are going to develop this problem. It simply says that this particular genetic mutation that you inherited from mom and dad might raise your risk for something, right? Now, the good news about that is, just like I said, it's not set in stone, right? It's an understanding of where your troubles might lie ahead. But with that information, you can really take action. And it could be anything as simple as a lifestyle change. It could be something as simple as, exercising more frequently. It could be something as simple as increasing fiber in your diet, or it could be something as invasive and complex as maybe preventative surgery, right? It is a varying degrees of things that you can do, things that are in your control that will in fact reduce your risk for developing these problems, even if you carry a genetic risk for them. And most people don't understand that. And I don't fault them. This is not something we talk about every day, right? But the good news is that the reason these tests are so significant and so important is because you can take action to change your fate. Your genes are actually not your destiny, as ironic as that is. They truly are not your destiny. And I'm the founder of a genetics company, and nothing would, behoove me more than telling you that your genes are everything. But the fact of the matter is, if you know what they're storing, if you know what they're carrying, you are your destiny, and your behavior can actually determine your destiny, not your genes.
Makes a lot of sense. If I found out tonight that I was predisposed to heart disease or have a heart attack, I'd probably go vegan tomorrow. When my wife and I had these conversations, I was on the extreme opposite of I want to know, and
Sure.
I appreciate you saying that. I didn't know if I could change the destiny of my genetics, but man, I bet I could at least prolong it.
Sure,
Mhm.
exactly. And the reverse is also true. You could not have any identified genetic changes, right? You have a perfectly beautiful, empty report, right, from us.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean you're not going to develop cancer. It
Sure.
doesn't mean you're not going to have heart disease, right? So what this does is it sort of just gives you a few more tools for your tool shed. That's how people should look at clinical genetic testing. Is it arms you with information, and it arms you with a potential plan for how to reduce these risks. So I think that's why it's so incredibly valuable, is because the information that comes off of them is super helpful for you in helping you make the right decisions for yourself.
Wyatt mentioned 23andMe and genealogy. How is it different with what you do at Panacea, different from 23andMe?
I always say, listen, companies like 23andMe walked so Panacea could run, essentially. And the reason I say that is because 23andMe and Ancestry and the likes brought genetics to the table, right? They brought genetics to the conversation. Prior to these companies, not only did we not think of genetics, but we probably understood very little about them. We didn't even think that we could understand our own genetics. Genetics is like a textbook topic. So what they did was they kind of introduced, the reality that you as an individual can now access this information that lives deep in your cells. And that's incredible. And we couldn't do what we do today without them doing that. So I'd like to say that first about 23andMe and that group of people or group of companies. Now, how we differ is we focus on the genes that are essentially playing a role in your health and in disease susceptibility. We don't really focus on ancestry or genealogy, even though we are screening your entire genetic library. What we focus on is delivering the information that could potentially inform you on what your disease susceptibility looks like so that you can get ahead of these issues. Now, 23andMe and I think even Ancestry, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. I think they offer teeny tiny little reviews of parts of genes or one or two genes that might impact your health. But the reality is there are thousands of genes that impact your health. And so if you only look at one gene or two genes, you're essentially missing pretty much everything that can tell you anything about your overall genetic health. And so we are intentionally reviewing your entire gene library, that's 20,000 plus genes, in order to identify if you have any known genetic changes that could increase your risk for disease so that you can get ahead of those things. And that's kind of really how we're different. We also offer clinical guidance. We have genetic counselors that are, a session with a genetic counselor is essentially included for free in the test when you purchase a test. That's certainly not something that almost any direct-to-consumer genetics company does.
Yeah, can you go into what you actually get on the counseling part of it? Because I was curious on that, how it's like with physician oversight as well as expert genetic counseling. I didn't quite know what that means.
Sure. So there's a physician, there's a doctor, essentially, that has to review and sign off on this prescription. This is a medical test. It has to be ordered by a doctor. You cannot just go to a lab and say, hey, give me this test. The test by law has to receive this order from a physician. So we have physician partners that understand the value of genetic testing, and they sign off on these orders. So when you purchase a test from us, your test request essentially goes to the doctor. They review your family history, which you fill out in a little form. And then if they have any questions, they could reach out to you. And if they think that you're a great candidate, they're going to sign off on it, and that gets sent to our lab. So that's physician oversight. Okay. In addition to that, there is a session with a genetic counselor. Genetic counselors are absolute experts on genetic testing. In fact, they are more trained on this than actual physicians. Their entire education revolved around understanding genetic testing and interpreting what these results mean for a patient. So when you sit down with a genetic counselor, they're going to look at your report and they're going to tell you exactly what it means. And they're going to tell you exactly what it doesn't mean. And they are going to essentially prepare you for what things you could do next, right? Based on your particular report and your particular summary. We always advise that even after you sit down with our counselors and even after you have a full understanding of what your report means and what your genetic health looks like, we always advise that you take this information to your doctor, because your doctor should be your healthcare partner, right? They should be informed on this information, and they should be the ones to guide you on what next steps look like. What kind of screenings do you need? What kind of blood work do you need? How often do you need this? They should be making these decisions with you based on your result and based on the counseling session with the genetic counselor.
I want to dive so much more into genetics, just for a baseline. I took a genetics class in college and barely passed it. But before I dive deeper into genetics and what you do, I want to learn a little bit about you, Dahlia, too. So first off, Panacea, fantastic name. Essentially, it's kind of the word is kind of a cure-all or a solution to, and I love the concept. Great naming convention. But what inspired you to start Panacea? Let's start there.
Yeah. So I'm truthfully the most unexciting part about Panacea. I'm not going to lie to you, but I'll give you a very teeny tiny background of how this all started. I wanted to be a doctor. I come from a long line of doctors. My dad's a doctor. My grandfather's a doctor. And I was always good at science and always interested in helping people and medicine. And so I was applying to medical school. I was actually graduating from the University of Miami here in Florida and applying to medical school. And I got a very obscure opportunity to work part-time for a small group of genetic laboratories. And my job at the labs was to sell genetic testing to doctors, basically. I had to kind of like a pharmaceutical sales rep, but a genetic testing sales rep. Easy peasy. I could do this in my sleep. Genetics is a huge part of my education. I'm going to be a doctor. I could schmooze them all day long. Like, no brainer, right? Make a little extra money while I'm playing med school. Well, I took the job and it was basically commission based, right? Like there was no salary. There was nothing. It's just commission. And I was like, I might not even go to med school. I might make so much money. I'll just do this. Little did I know, in about 90 to 120 days, I made $0. $0. And I was blown away at how unbelievably difficult it was, not only to convince physicians to use this type of test for their patients, but to actually get insurance companies to pay for a test that could save the life of a patient. And I couldn't believe it, because I was like, not only is this test life-saving, not only could this test save a ton of money by avoiding disease and the expensive costs of disease, but it is the future of healthcare. It's genetics. It's central to precision medicine. It's central to personalized healthcare. How is it that no one can get their hands on this test? Insurance companies aren't covering it. Doctors don't want to prescribe it. And I really said to myself, this is a massive problem and I need to figure out why. Why were these problems what they were? And I kind of decided to put a pin in med school and say, I can't look away from this like train wreck. I need to figure it out. And it was a long, arduous, multi-year long journey until I really peeled back all of the layers of the problems and ultimately created a solution like Panacea. I think the number one thing that I realized about our healthcare system is that not only is it extremely fragmented, right? You have all of these stakeholders. You have doctors and hospitals and insurance companies and the government and patients and pharma and labs. You have all of these stakeholders, but all of these stakeholders are incentivized completely differently. And they have completely different goals and they have completely different priorities. And no one is forcing them to be on the same page. No one, not even the government's forcing everybody to be on the same page. And so when you have a fragmented, massive system, you have these problems, right? No one really cares about the patient getting this test. No one really cares about saving money. It's chaos, absolute chaos. And so the only thing that really solved this problem was a solution like Panacea, which is bringing the decision to the ultimate decision maker, which was the patient. You are the one that's going to benefit most from getting this test. And you should be the one that is able to access it and pays for it, essentially, right? And then we have doctors on board and the experts on board to guide you, but you are the ultimate decision maker and you are the one that's going to benefit most. So you should be the one in control. That's why we are what we are. Long story short.
So if insurance isn't covering it, how do you make it accessible to people? Because I'm sure like any test you go to the hospital, the bill adds up pretty quickly. So if it's out of pocket, how is it affordable? What have you done to kind of make it be able to be accessible to the masses?
Yeah. So one of the things that I learned in that long, nasty journey of peeling back all the layers of the problems is that insurers in a lot of ways are a big part of the problem. And believe it or not, costs of healthcare are sometimes more expensive with insurance, not less expensive. So what we decided to do is test it out. We basically went directly to the laboratories that run these types of tests. And we said to them, listen, we don't deal with insurance and we don't even want you to deal with insurance. We don't want you to bill the insurers. What we want to do is we want to bring you recurring business and we want you to give us the best possible price. You're going to save money on negotiating with the insurers. You don't have to bill the insurers. You don't even have to have a billing team anymore to manage all the insurance billing. What can you do for us, essentially? And ironically, that was a dream scenario for them. And so when we contracted directly with the labs, directly with the providers of these tests, we were able to shave the costs substantially, because you're cutting out all these middlemen that are incentivized to keep these prices high and are incentivized to make things complicated. And we made their lives a lot more simple. So when you start to ask why things are happening and you start to say, maybe I could do this better, you start to actually solve a lot of problems. And that's kind of what we did. And we have very specialized contracts with the laboratories. And we have laboratories that are very like-minded, right? It's very important that they have the same mission we do, which they do. And because of that, we're able to bring really expensive quality medical genetic testing directly to people for a fraction of what it costs even through insurance. So that's kind of how we did it.
I'm really excited to hear this perspective, Dahlia, because it's kind of a trend I've noticed before. It started with, I don't know, several years ago. Me and my wife were having a child and we found out that there were new shops popping up. This is, years ago, honestly, where you could go in and get an ultrasound or like a 3D ultrasound, completely separate from the doctors and the hospitals. And you paid your price, which at the end of the day was probably way less with insurance. I'm 100% on board with you there. And it got me thinking, when I went there, I was like, this is fascinating. Like, you have the ability to manage your own healthcare to a degree. Um,
Mhm.
and then I've started seeing a lot more ads or things pop up for things like full body scans. And there's places that have their own MRI machines now, CAT scans. You can go
That's right.
and now you can do your own genetic testing. What do you think is the the driving force? This might be a loaded question because I think I know the answer, but it feels like the average U.S. citizen is taking much more control of their own healthcare because it's getting a little inaccessible sometimes. Is that what you're saying? Because I feel like if I can't imagine what the bill would be, even with insurance, to get a full genetic testing on potential health issues through your doctor or hospital. And
Mhm.
while yes, private genetic testing is still not what many people would be considered cheap, I feel like
Mhm.
that the value is still there. Full body scans, MRIs, genetic testing, 3D ultrasounds, all without having to involve the military, geez, look at me go, the medical complex. I'm fascinated by people kind of taking back their own healthcare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, you probably already know the answer, but the bottom line is that health insurance is getting more and more expensive, and your out of pocket responsibilities are getting higher and higher and higher. And so, and you're getting less, by the way. You're probably even getting less healthcare. They're more in control of what doctors you see, when you see the doctor, what drugs you can get, what drugs your physician can prescribe, right? They're in control of all of these decisions. And so you have less autonomy, but yet you have to spend more. So people are starting to say, well, if I'm going to be spending this money anyway, my insurance company is requiring me to pay a $5,000 deductible or what have you, right? I might as well get smart and see what I can access on my own. And companies like Panacea, companies like Prenuvo with the MRI scans, companies like Levels. Levels is an awesome continuous glucose monitoring company for people who are really interested in keeping their glucose levels stable for longevity. These types of companies didn't exist 20 years ago, but they're existing now because the technology's here and it's possible to make this stuff accessible directly to the consumer. And you're going to see this so much more often and so much more commonly as time goes on because the technology is not going anywhere. It's getting better. It's getting cheaper. It's getting more accessible, more affordable. And people are becoming more educated, more interested, more themselves wanting to get in control of their health, wanting to live long, wanting to live healthfully. And insurance is just becoming more and more disappointing. So you're going to see this trend perpetuate and you're already seeing it. And I think it's fantastic. Now, I say that with a caveat because I don't think that that means that we don't need healthcare anymore and we don't need physicians and we don't need insurance. We still do. Insurance is still vital. I mean, God forbid you get in an accident and you need $100,000 surgery. You're going to be very thankful you have insurance, right? So it's vital. And I'm not here to really trash talk anyone or anything. I think this stuff is very important. Physicians will never not be important. The clinical experts will never not be important. But the accessibility and the decision-making power is shifting now towards the number one person, which is you as the consumer and you as the patient. Yeah. And I'm really happy to be part of that trend in genetics.
You mentioned longevity, and that's something that I've been getting into more and more as I get closer and closer to 40 here soon.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel like in my family, we're kind of going through like a cycle change where, my grandparents have now all passed. My parents are getting older and becoming, are now grandparents, and I'm hitting that middle of
Sure.
the life stage. And you're
Sure.
seeing the importance of having good health as you get into older and older age and
Sure.
making sure that you're around and the ability. So longevity is one of these big things where everyone's like, well, as you hit 40, you're like, well, that's like middle aged. They're talking about maybe now we can live to 100 or 120. So what is life going
Right.
to look like that? And I see
Right.
all the screenings and I see all the different drugs and things, and it does feel very inaccessible. it feels like it's only the wealthy that can get access to these things. And so there's
Mhm.
potentially a big have and have nots depending on where you actually stand financially. Um,
Mhm.
so it's exciting to see that for a relatively low amount of money, you can get the test, understand where you're at. I do want to dive into a bit deeper on like what can you do with the information though? If we're talking about longevity, if we're talking about quality of health, what are some real pertinent life things that you can do with this information so you can live longer and live better?
I think you bring up a fair point about this entire space being still relatively inaccessible because it can be expensive. I think that's a fair point, and I think it's something that we even struggle with. Our testing, although extremely comprehensive and comes with clinical care and is a fraction of the current cost through, the traditional healthcare system, we still feel like it still might be inaccessible for a large amount of people. Right now, our retail is $1,000, and with some specials, you can get, sometimes a couple $100s off, but that's still not totally affordable. I think that's really a consequence of a brand new technology. We are limited by the cost that our labs have. And our labs are limited by the machinery that exists to sequence the tech, right? And it's still not totally cheap. It's decreasing, absolutely. But it's still not $100 for a whole exome, right? It will get there. It's just not there yet. And it's like the Tesla model. Tesla entered the market at a $150,000 car, right? I think something like that. But today, after iterations and tech improvement and scalability and economies of scale, you can get a Tesla for like what, 30, 40, $50,000, right? So you're going to see that happen. You're going to see that happen to all of these awesome techs that we're talking about, the MRI screenings and the whole exome sequence. It's going to happen. It's just going to take some time, and it's going to take some innovation. Companies like ours really pushing the envelope and partnering with the experts, the labs, the genetic counselors who have the same mindset and who do want to push that cost down so that it is more accessible. But it will take a little bit of time. So I wanted to address that because I think it's a really important point. But your question about how can these results actually be used? I think, like I mentioned earlier, one of the best examples is your risk for colon cancer, or even your risk for breast cancer, or your risk for pancreatic cancer. There's a ton of genetic mutations that essentially could increase your risk for these problems. And the best thing to do is take that information to your doctor and say, Doc, I have this risk. Statistically, I am 20% more likely to develop this problem than the average person, or I am 50% more likely. Your genetic counselor will always explain your risk assessment to you. Your doctor is absolutely informed and is the ultimate expert on all of the medical interventions that exist that could help assist you. For colon cancer, still till this day, even with something like Cologuard, the best way to detect early and identify colon cancer is through a colonoscopy. And if you are, I think, 45 in the United States today, I think they decreased the age from 50 to 45, you should start getting colon cancer screenings once a year. I think every year until you get like a clear colonoscopy, and then you can skip a few years. But 45 is the age for you to get a colonoscopy. If you have a genetic risk for colon cancer, you need to start colonoscopies at like 35 or maybe even 40 or before 40. So if you have access to this information, like I said, you can begin doing the things that you might do later in life, right? Based on the proper clinical guidance. You might start doing it a lot earlier, because the key here is to identify these problems in very early stages. That is the best bet at really either eliminating these problems, like eliminating your risk of getting cancer completely, or catching it so early to where it doesn't become lethal. That's the key here. Knowing that you have these genetic risks so you can act earlier. And there are already medical interventions that exist to minimize these problems, But because you might have this information early, you can start doing these things at a lot earlier stages in your life to kind of stop those diseases from happening at much earlier stages. That's really, again, the key here, right? It's acting early before these problems exist.
So, one thing that I have been hesitant to do, I have not taken any of the genetic tests, whether it's for genealogy or medical, is there's, I think, a prevalent concern for your personal private information.
Mhm.
And, I think we've all heard maybe some horror stories about someone who took a genealogy DNA test, and I don't even have a great example in my head, but somehow it came back and bit them. Can you talk a little bit about the privacy factors behind genetic testing, and are the concerns about privacy unfounded, or is that something that consumers still need to be aware of?
There's a federal law called GINA. GINA is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. What that law does is it protects a consumer or a patient from being discriminated against from an insurer. Slightly different than what we're talking about here, but
Sure.
I think it's good to understand these big concepts first. The good news about that is no matter what your genetic results are, your insurer cannot change their premiums or hike up your costs because you are more at risk for developing a problem. So it really eliminates the concern of what if my insurance company drops me, or I don't want my insurance company to know I have this problem, or whatever, right? That law exists to protect you so that you can feel safe getting this test without feeling discriminated against. So that's a federal law. Every state in the union has to abide by that. The only area where that doesn't totally protect you is life insurance. Life insurance in some states can say, oh, you have a genetic mutation that makes you more at risk for breast cancer or ovarian cancer, whatever. And so your premium is going to be a little higher, right? Because that's more risky for us. Not every state allows for that, but some states do. So you have to know, what your states regulate. So that's the protective side of discrimination for genetics. The other side that you're talking about is more so data privacy, right? It is really astonishing that in this country, as soon as DNA leaves your body, the courts have decided that it is no longer yours. It is not yours. It belongs to the holder of your DNA, whether it's a doctor or a hospital or a company like Panacea or 23andMe or whatever. Now, what you need to know as a consumer is what are the actual corporate policies of the company that you are giving your DNA to. It is always in the fine print of that long, boring agreement that you're signing or consent that you're signing when you get blood work or when you go to a doctor. But if you read it, you'll realize that as long as they de-identify the data, meaning they strip it of information that connects it back to you, your name's not associated, your address is not associated, your social is not associated, nothing that can link your genetic data back to you as a human being. If that is stripped, they can do whatever they want with your genetic information, right? It's perfectly legal. I will tell you, I believe that most companies and most health systems and most doctors are really doing right by your information. They're not doing nefarious things with it. They're doing everything in their power to protect it digitally. But let's face it, errors happen, hacks happen. Hackers can access this information. And it can be compromised. It can. There's no way of sugarcoating that. But I do believe that most companies really are doing their best, and they are doing a successful job at really keeping your data private. But let's assume the worst happens and your entire genetic code leaks and it goes somewhere. The bottom line is it's almost valueless. There is almost nothing that can be done with your raw genetic information. There's no lab in God knows where cloning you. Like this is not a thing, right? There's also almost no market value to your raw data. You can't even sell an individual's raw data just as raw data with no context to a pharma company. They won't even touch it. It means nothing. It means nothing to them. They can't even make sense of it or use it in a useful way. So I don't know if that's going to relieve some people, but the bottom line is it's not as special or significant as you would imagine. And so very little can be done with it. As far as your health, your health genetics, your ancestry might be a little bit different. We don't touch ancestry, by the way. We don't look at that stuff. Your ancestry might be different because it could connect you with other people, right? Because it shows how you're related to other people. So that may cause a whole other can of worms. It's true.
That's how they caught the Golden State Killer, actually.
Right, exactly. But for us, that's not an area that we really dabble in. We don't really work in that space. We work in the genes that are specific to, your healthcare and your disease susceptibility. So yeah, I don't know if I answered all of your questions, but that's kind of where we sit.
I think you gave it really solid context. I think consumers are hypersensitive. Every one of us has had our data stolen. Every one of us is being sold on some dark web website, our social security, our credit cards. It's happened to pretty much everyone now. And I think people are getting hypersensitive about their personal information. But you make a really solid case that who cares if they have my genetic sequence raw data? That's great context. Thank you.
Right. And to an earlier point that I was saying also is when you get blood work, when you go to the dentist, when there's any tissue that leaves your body in any way, shape, or form, that holds your genes. Your genes are in there. And so your genes have probably been accessed and pulled a million times before. You probably aren't even aware of what has been accessed, right? And frankly, it's like I said, it's valueless. Like it's not even that significant.
That's a good point.
Since the founding of the company a little over 8 years ago, how has genetic testing evolved and progressed, and where is it heading as well?
Good question. So I think, believe it or not, most of our 8 years has been in, like I said, peeling back those problems, right? Research and development and understanding how do we make this stuff more accessible to people. That's literally been our question from day one. And it's still our question. Like, how do we improve this? How do we make this more accessible to more and more people? So that has been a constant in the last 8 years. But the tech itself has actually become a little bit cheaper and a little bit faster and a little bit better in terms of accuracy and speed and turnover. And I think the most exciting part to me is that cost decrease. With every new generation machine that our labs acquire from the great Illumina, I don't know if you guys have heard of Illumina. Illumina is like the Apple of genetic sequencing machines, right? They're the greatest. And every single machine that they push out is quicker and stronger and allows you to do things cheaper. So I'm really excited to see really where that's going to go. And I hope I live to see the day where, you get a $10 exome. That would be amazing. Like anybody and everybody on planet Earth should get this test if they want it, and they should be able to afford it. It should be like a bottle of water at some point. So I'm excited about that because I think that more and more people getting this test, it is going to just catapult healthcare in a way that we can't even imagine.
If you had to narrow it down to one or two, what would you say have been the biggest challenges you have faced in growing Panacea?
Oh man, great question. There's so many challenges. I don't even know how to pick one. I think this is kind of boring, but it's true. I think getting people to do things differently in a way that they're not used to, even though it's better, even though it has value, even though it's life-saving, even though it's cheaper, even though it is inarguably the better way to do things, people just don't want to do things differently. They just don't want to. And I think one of our biggest hurdles as a team is figuring out what is going to motivate people to do things differently. And that's across the board. It's not just the consumer that's buying this product. It's the doctor that's going to recommend this product. It's, the genetic counselor even that's going to interpret this product. It's every single stakeholder involved in this process. It's showing them and convincing them how to do things a little bit differently. And that's been tough. It's been tough. I mean, I think we still struggle with it. We still haven't quite figured out what the recipe is, but that's a hard one. Getting people to change their behavior. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, if you crack that code, you're set for life.
I know, right? And I think also disarming people, because this is scary, right? Just like
Sure.
your wife said, like, I don't want to know. Teaching people, educating people on why that fear is actually kind of not a real fear, right? Because you can do something about it. So you shouldn't be afraid. You should want to know. Yeah, that piece is big too. Educating, informing, introducing, this novel stuff to people and getting them to change their behavior is just tough.
Well, Dahlia, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you online?
They can visit our website at seekpanacea.com. That's SEEKPANACEA.com.
What you're doing in terms of like bringing accessibility is very much in what we're standing for here in the podcast. We're decentralized opportunity, which at the beginning is like, oh, there's business opportunity pretty much anywhere. You don't have to kind of live in a major hub, but more and more it's becoming obvious that it's not just about business, it's about life too, and quality of life. And living in rural Southwest Nebraska, you don't get access to a lot of the best medical care. And again, like we talked about before, it feels often it's so inaccessible to get the things that maybe are proactive that can make your life a lot better, make you healthier, the quality of food and quality of all these different things. And so your mission and bringing the knowledge of someone's genetics is incredible. I really, really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. That means so much to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think what you and your team at Panacea are doing, I fully believe you guys will see nothing but more success. I really feel you are on the edge of something pretty amazing here. And once you crack that code on getting people to change their behavior, the sky's the limit. But seriously, this is a really amazing product.
It takes people like you. It takes literally, I'm not even remotely trying to flatter you. It takes people like you who take interest in what we're doing, who talk about what we're doing, who share what we're doing with the audience, and ask astute, smart questions so that people listening can really understand and learn something new and really get to understand this topic better. It literally takes people like you. So don't underestimate the power of what you're doing as well.
Well, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who made it to the end. We will see you all next week. Bye-bye.